My name is Max Latona, and I'm a philosophy professor here at St. Anselm College and also the executive director of the Center for Ethics in Society. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you, both here in person and online, to this, what we can call the center's opening event for the 21-22 academic year. Pleased to see so many of you here, especially students, but also colleagues in the faculty and from the administration. And I know many of you that are there online as well. So thank you for attending. Tonight's program is entitled Explaining the Gap Between the Rich and the Poor. And in a moment, my colleague at the center, Jason, will introduce our featured speaker and our respondents. I'd like to note that today's event is actually part of a larger program that the center, in conjunction with the Institute for Humane Studies, is running this weekend. With the help of IHS, the center has invited scholars from around the country to participate in an interdisciplinary workshop on the question of how political equality affects economic equality. Tomorrow, Saturday, and Sunday, over a dozen scholars from the fields of economics, political science, philosophy, I think history, and other disciplines will share their insights and vigorously debate questions of equality, political representation, structural barriers to economic opportunity, and a host of other related and important topics. We thank the Institute for Humane Studies for their support. Before we go forward with this evening's event and this weekend's workshop, it is worth pausing for a moment to ask ourselves why we're discussing these topics in the first place. That is, why are political equality, economic equality, the gap between the rich and the poor important things to think and talk about? Why do we care? The answer, I think, is twofold. First, we have a concern about justice. Are we, whether wittingly or unwittingly, as a society, unfairly placing obstacles in the path of others in their pursuit of happiness? If so, what are those obstacles and what remedies, if any, are appropriate? Second, I think it's about compassion. If others in our community are suffering or harmed in some meaningful or non-trivial ways, what responsibility or duty do we have as individuals, as a community, to respond? I submit that these two concerns, concerns of justice and compassion, underlie our inquiry today and our workshop this weekend. They're enduring questions, but ones we cannot ignore as long as we are human beings living in community. So how do we go about answering these questions? Well, the center believes very strongly that scholarly workshops, such as will happen this weekend at the college with the support of IHS, are vital for advancing research and inquiry on these important topics. At the same time, we also think that this academic discourse should not be confined to the ivory tower, so to speak, but that much can be gained by sharing ideas with the broader public and inviting questions, response, and feedback. That is why we've invited some of these scholars to speak to you tonight. Truth, they say, if it is to emerge, can only do so through the fiery crucible of debate and critique. Your response and feedback to the ideas presented today are welcome, whether you are here in person or joining us remotely. With that, I will now ask my colleague, Dr. Jason Sorens, Director of the Center for Ethics in Society, to introduce our speakers. Thank you again for coming. Jason.
Thank you, Max. And we are very pleased to have these distinguished speakers with us today to talk about this important topic, important ethical topic of inequality, how we explain it, and what to do about it. The way this is going to work is we're going to have Jonathan first present some of his research, including work from his book, A Republic of Equals. Great book. I recommend that you all take a look at it online. And some of his more recent research, including work that he'll be presenting at this weekend's workshop. And then we're going to have commentary from both a political scientist and a political philosopher on this work and what it means for us. So I'd like to introduce Jonathan at this time. Jonathan Rothwell is the principal economist at Gallup. There, he leads research activities for clients on diverse topics, including higher education, job quality, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, automation, and entrepreneurship. Before joining Gallup in 2016, he was a fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he is currently a non-resident senior fellow and works primarily on issues related to the African American experience. His scholarly work specializes in labor economics, political economy, and applied econometrics. He holds a PhD from Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. He contributes to the New York Times Upshot column. He is also the author of the 2019 book, A Republic of Equals, a Manifesto for a Just Society, published by Princeton University Press. Jonathan.
Thank you, Jason and Max. It's a great pleasure to be with you all this evening. It's a thrill to have the opportunity to discuss a topic I so cherish, justice, and how it relates to economics. So as Max pointed out in his remarks, I want to start with some motivation about why we should care about inequality. Inequality relates to fairness, and justice can be thought of as fairness, as John Rawls argued. Fairness is not some abstract concept. It is an ancient, and I'd argue, biologically rooted cultural characteristic. Imagine you're a customer or merchant in an ancient Greek marketplace. You bring a 1 pound weight or the equivalent in talents to the market and put it on a scale. You want the same weight in beef, for example, in exchange for 2 grams of silver, which was roughly the going rate back then. The weight decides whether the trade is fair and acceptable. The name of the United Kingdom's currency, the pound, conveys the essential relationship between economics and balance or proportionality. And indeed, the idea that fairness and proportionality are closely related is found in the writings of writers throughout the world, throughout history. Aristotle went so far as to argue that everyone agrees that awards should be based on, at least partly based on, merit. The anthropological concept of reciprocity is closely tied to this conception of fairness and can be found in every society with documented evidence, archaeological or otherwise. One can find writing affirming the essential importance of reciprocity from every continent. This is crucial for evaluating income distributions. Consider 3 criteria for evaluating income distributions: equity, the well-being of the least off, and proportionality. That is income against productivity. Most left liberal thinkers arguably emphasize the first, that is how much income goes to the poorest members of society, whereas both the left and the right spend a lot of time arguing about which arrangements lead to the well-being of the least off. And the left often, I would say, neglects a third aspect of evaluating inequality. Sorry, got to. Just pause 1 second here.
Just trying to get that.
Oh, okay. Okay. And so, as I was saying, I think the left often neglects the proportionality aspect of the income distribution. And so just take a simple example. Person A produces 100 units and is paid 90 units. Person B produces 50 units and is paid 60. This distribution is roughly equal to productivity. So you could say it's roughly merit-based. And it compares favorably on all 3 criteria that I just mentioned to a second distribution where A and B produce the same amount, 50, but person A is paid 70 and person B is only paid 30. So it turns out that ordinary people around the world also care about proportionality and the relationship between merit and pay when considering income distributions. Proof for this comes from an amazing experiment involving 65,000 people in 60 countries conducted by Norwegian economists using the Gallup World Poll. One group of survey takers was assigned into a disproportionate group where pay was not based on merit. They were told person A and B did the same work, but person A was paid $6 more. A second group was put in a proportionate condition where A was more productive and still paid the same $6 more. The dilemma confronting survey takers was this: how much of the $6 do you give to person B, if any? The results from this showed that there was a global preference for proportionality. Most people around the world rejected inequality when it was not based on merit, but accepted it when it was. When asked about their own countries, the majority of people, 69% globally, said prevailing inequality in their country was unfair, suggesting that they think it's not simply a matter of merit. The United States has the largest partisan gaps in who believes that inequality is fair or unfair. So only 26% of those who have an unfavorable opinion of President Trump, who was president at the time of the survey, believe that income inequality was unfair in the United States. Sorry, those who had a favorable view of Trump, only 26% said it was unfair, whereas 75% of those who had an unfavorable view of Trump said that income inequality in the United States was unfair. And overall, residents of the United States were less likely than those in many parts of the world to say that inequality is unfair, but still a majority of Americans said it was unfair. And I'd have to say that I agree with the majority of the global population in that prevailing inequality in the United States, I think in important respects is unfair, as I will explain in much more detail. But let me first provide some basic facts of the US and international income distribution. So the first point I'd like to make is that good institutions, those that treat people equally under the law and defend property rights and other liberties, tend to have less inequality, not more. If inequality were purely merit-based, you'd expect this pattern to go the other way. The second point is that income inequality in the United States fell during the periods of highest economic growth, roughly between 1920 and 1970. And then sometime around 1980, inequality started to increase again. And on this line, I've got inequality measured in 3 different ways, just to show you that this trend is not dependent on the source of data or how you measured it, whether you use just wage data from the Social Security Administration, which characterizes labor income, you see the same pattern, or if you use only income revealed through tax records, or if you try to allocate the entire national currency.
I'm gonna try one thing here.
Okay.
Try to make that visible to people. Did that do anything? Did not. Did not. I think we are.
Is it, maybe it is?
Yeah.
Sorry, Jonathan.
Well, no worries. Swap president, yeah, you better not do that. Okay, we'll just carry on. Sorry for those that there was a banner at the top there. Hopefully you can still see the graph. And the dotted line there at the bottom is the labor share of income. So labor income is slightly more equitable than capital income, which is, or so considerably more equitable than capital income, which is why that line's lower. The dark green line is overall GDP per capita, or productivity growth. And so the point is productivity growth is much higher during the era of lower income inequality in the United States, which suggests that technological innovation and economic growth are not necessarily a cause of income inequality. And indeed, we see this same pattern holding outside of the United States. So if you look at OECD countries, and in the period of 1960 to 1980, annual growth was 3.6%. And then if you look at the period 1980 to 2018, it fell to 2.5%. And at that same period, the share of income going to the top 1% of income earners increased in OECD countries from 7% to 11%. And the United States increased from 11% to 19%. Another point that's really crucial to understanding the basic facts of income inequality is that the United States really stands out among countries, not just in the OECD, but certainly in the OECD, But globally, the United States has fairly high levels of income inequality, comparable to countries like India and South Africa. And not only is it high today, but it was high in 1980. And so any theory of why income inequality exists or how to account for changes needs to account for those basic facts. Another important point is that not all of the income gains have gone to the super rich. So if you segment out the top 0.1% of the income distribution, these are people who make at least $1.3 million in 2014, they took in roughly half of the income gains from 1980 to up to 2014. But another big chunk of income went to the group that is in between the 90th percentile and the top 0.1 percentile, just below the top 0.01 percentile, with the top 1% doing the best. But essentially, you could think of this group as the upper middle class, and they have also done extremely well over this period. So it's not just the super rich. Income inequality has also led to wealth inequality. Those with incomes below the median are generally taking on debt and have no wealth at all, or at least no net worth, while those at or near the top are saving and investing, growing their wealth. This is reflected in rising wealth inequality, which has coincided with rising income inequality. Most scholars agree on these basic facts. So how do conventional theories explain them? The most influential theory, I'd say, is skill-biased technological change. The basic premise is that technology increased the relative demand for skills, usually measured as educational attainment. Evidence includes the finding that people who work with computers saw higher wage growth in the 1990s during a period of rising inequality. A more sophisticated version of the argument is that technology has changed not just the supply and demand for skills, but for tasks, the economically valuable things people do as part of their job. There's a lot of strength behind this theory, but to some extent it breaks down when looking at the top of the income distribution, where measured skill is rather unimportant in distinguishing people by income. The theory also ignores the role of political influence in shaping how tasks are compensated, a major oversight in my opinion. Another theory for rising inequality is globalization. There's no question that highly paid blue-collar unionized jobs in manufacturing are less common in rich countries like the United States than they once were. But trade has also compensated those workers by decreasing the price for other valuable goods and services and opened new opportunities in other occupations and industries. Aside from those observations, trade can't explain international patterns in inequality or the predominance of top earners in domestic industries. Another conventional theory is falling unionization, but it can't explain the rise of the top 1% in never unionized industries or among employees. 2/3 of the top 1% are not managers, for example, nor can explain why most individuals in the top 1% own small, closely held businesses in highly regulated service industries. If the minimum wage were increased to $20, for example, the owners of these companies would still be just as rich. Tax policy is also an unlikely cause of these trends in inequality. The taxes as a share of income paid by the top 1% have not substantially changed over this period of rising inequality. Other major gaps in the theory, as I'm describing these conventional theories, is that there's really no accounting for race and no explanation as to why the United States had higher income inequality in 1980 than other democracies. There are also big problems with what you might call less conventional theories. So one of these is commonly thought of as superstar theory, that the globalization has disproportionately rewarded superstars like celebrities and entertainers and professional athletes. This has certainly been the case. The problem is that superstars are extremely rare, and yet there are many people in the top 1% who are certainly not superstars by any stretch of the imagination. Another theory that is often brought up and has been mentioned in some economics journals is the rich are on average have more skills or are extraordinarily smart. But as I'll show in a few moments, there's not much evidence for that. Even among the top 1%, there's conventional measures of talent and ability are slightly above average, but not nearly as high as would warrant the incomes that they bring in. Marxist-like theories also fail in important respects. Corporations are declining in significance. Labor income has become more unequal and is twice as important computationally as capital income. So these changes in income inequality are not just driven by a rise in capital income. Let me quickly review some evidence on some of these points. Trade as a share of GDP across countries is negatively correlated with inequality. And trade is less important to the US economy than it is to many European and Asian democracies with lower levels of income inequality. The number of international patents filed per person is a measure of a country's innovative output. In general, greater innovation means less inequality. Northern European countries do very well on these measures and yet have very low levels of income inequality. Also, corporate profits are not a higher share of GDP in more unequal countries. And the United States does not stand out as having a high share of its income going to corporate profits. Around the world, most people, about 2/3, are of those who are in the top 1% of their country's income distribution, are not managers, nor are they CEOs. This makes it unlikely that the management versus worker conflict story that we often hear is responsible for extreme inequality. Again, the US does not stand out as having a high share of managers at the top of the income distribution. Likewise, the top 1% rarely work in manufacturing and other extractive exporting industries. The global average is 18%, meaning 18% of those at the top of their nation's income distribution are in the manufacturing sector. In the United States, it's slightly less. So where does the United States stand out? It turns out that professional elites, which you can find as doctors, lawyers, workers in finance, and some other groups, are very highly compensated in the United States relative to the median worker. And countries that reward this group of professionals tend to have the highest income inequality. Occupational-based differences in pay are not closely tied to conventional measures of skill, such as scores on cognitive exams. Cognitive ability explains a relatively small share of variation in compensation using within-country rankings of income. Occupational differences are twice as important as cognitive differences and remain more important when one controls directly for cognitive ability. So this chart here is showing globally test scores on an international exam conducted by the OECD of cognitive ability, and information and communication technology professionals, science and engineering professionals are among those who score the highest, and yet they are not the most highly compensated workers around the world. And I think it's also notable that the gaps, even among those who are in the highest group, they're usually less than a standard deviation away from the median. So in other words, you don't have to be an extraordinary genius to work in these occupations. And there are a lot of people working as managers and CEOs who are very close to the average in terms of how they score on cognitive ability. And in fact, if you took the test scores of top income earners around the world, you see that they get 108.8 would be their IQ score, which means essentially half a standard deviation above the mean. And if you just look at CEOs only, they're slightly above average. And if you look even within the United States, you see roughly the same pattern. Another important trend here, as to the evaluation of more left-leaning theories of corporate power, is that we've seen a fading importance of American corporations over this period of rising income inequality. So in 1980, 87% of national revenue was going to corporations. I say national business revenue, and that fell to 60% in 2015. Meanwhile, the share of adults in the United States who are in the top 1% has changed by industry and occupation. So in 1980, 15% roughly of those at the top of the US income distribution were in healthcare professionals or in the healthcare industry as managers in the healthcare industry. So you could say managers of hospitals. And that increased to about 19% in 2017. We also saw a big change in the composition with respect to the financial service industry, where roughly 9% of people in the top 1% were in finance in 1980, and that jumped up to 17% in 2017. Also an increase in the representation of those in legal service industries. And meanwhile, there was a big drop in the manufacturing sector. So it's hard to tell the story that globalization and deunionization have led to rising income inequality when manufacturing is less important as a source of inequality. So in part of my book, I have a thought experiment to further clarify this relationship between skills and compensation in the US economy. So imagine that you could assign everyone in the US economy income based only on their scores on cognitive exams, their personality, so to the extent to which they exhibit grit and determination, their age, their years of education, and then compare that to the actual income distribution. Do you think it would stay the same? Do you think this hypothetical distribution would be less equal or more equal? The answer is that if you assigned income based just on those characteristics that are associated with greater productivity at the individual level, inequality would fall by half. I published this chart in the New York Times and when I laid out this argument, and it compares the actual income distribution by decile to this hypothetical one. And you can see that at the top 10%, so the top of this distribution, 30% of income is in the actual US income distribution is going to those at the top. Whereas if you assigned income based on these productive characteristics, it would only be 19%. The reason for this is simple, that the distribution of talent is much more egalitarian than the distribution of income. So returning to this question I raised at the start of this presentation about what makes the United States stand out in the global income distribution rankings, I want to consider several features that are usually left out of economic theories of the income distribution. One is the United States stands out for being a particularly diverse country racially, one of the most diverse countries in the world, in fact, using data from the economists Louis Putterman and David Weil. Now, this is important because the modern economy arose during a period in the 20th century, especially at the start of the 20th century, when most people of European origins were under the mistaken belief and adopted the mythology of a racial hierarchy that put them at the top of the skill and talent distribution. And as a consequence of that, they created caste-like institutions, such as the Jim Crow system in the United States, that essentially preserved their status and made it impossible or very difficult for people in the caste that they considered to be lower caste to move up. And those institutions, which were also prevalent in South Africa, by the way, were destructive to political equality and have lasting consequences today, or so I would argue. One of the consequences is that the United States stands out in terms of the level of racial and economic segregation that it's exhibited in its cities and metropolitan areas. Now, it's very hard to get data in a large number of countries on segregation, but the Gallup World Poll asked people in over 100 countries around the world to rate neighborhood quality. So it asked them questions like, do you feel safe and secure when you go out at night in your neighborhood? And would you recommend your neighborhood to other people as a good place to live? If you take people's scores on these items, you can create something like a neighborhood quality index. And what I did is I compared this neighborhood quality index score for those near the top of the income distribution to those at the bottom of the income distribution and took the difference. And in the United States has the largest gap among OECD countries and one of the largest gaps in the world. Other countries that stand out globally would be non-democratic countries that have severe ethnic conflicts, as well as countries like South Africa that have a history of enforced segregation. Another way that the United States stands out globally is in the share of income that we spend on healthcare services. So in the United States, 18 cents of every dollar in the country goes to healthcare. That's twice as large as the average OECD country, and yet our health outcomes in the United States are worse, not better, than our OECD peers. As the economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton have argued in a recent book, the healthcare industry is like Robin Hood in reverse. It takes money from the poor and middle class and redistributes it to the elites of the healthcare industry, including doctors and managers and CEOs of hospitals, with many pernicious side effects, I'd argue. Now, with all this background, I'd like to turn to what I consider to be a general theory of the income distribution and point out some features that I think need to be part of any theory of the income distribution. First, it has to account for merit, or call it talent. And we need a theory for where talent originates. I think of talent as having a genetic, family, and public component. Now, my interpretation of the genomic literature is that something like 10% of the variation in educational attainment can be explained by the configuration of SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And SNPs, when bundled together, are genes. They're the building blocks of genes. Assuming that is a reasonable estimate, which comes out of that literature, and I'll be happy to discuss the methods they used to calculate that, that still leaves plenty of room for familial or household influences, as well as public influences that come from formal institutions like schools and informal institutions like culture, peer, and neighborhood influences. Now, in politically egalitarian societies, the public component should be roughly equal, meaning that the quality of schooling should be roughly equal. And as I argue, local communities aim to partly redress problems that arise in inequality and familial resources. For example, English language courses were often provided to European immigrants in the early 20th century, which helped close test score gaps among the children of immigrants, which were very high at the time. Income, in turn, depends on talent and power. Though in a politically egalitarian society, power differences are minimal. With political inequality, power is based on group membership, some of which depends on birth, like race, class, and gender. Other sources of power are based on social membership in a guild, a union, or professional association. And of course, in a politically egalitarian society, those group membership differences become trivial. A fair society is one that pays based on revealed talent with appropriate redistribution under conditions of political equality. So that's the main thesis of my argument, essentially, that the distribution of income would be much more equal if people were rewarded based strictly on observed performance or ability or value to society, because talent itself varies much less than the US income distribution. Now, as to what the sources of inequality are in the United States, I've already hinted at many of them, but I'd like to spend a little time going through in some more detail. So one is unequal access to the development of talent. So race-based disinvestment in human capital and wealth, as an example, economic and racial segregation and neighborhood effects. There's also unequal access to the realization of talent once talent has been developed. That could consist of what economists call rent seeking, which is essentially distorting the rules of the economy to the advantage of a group. And that group could be a powerful interest group. And then leaders of certain industries that enjoy special privileges and lack of competition, as I would argue the case for many hospitals and hedge funds. And on the other end, markets for low-skilled workers are often hurt by the criminalization of immigration. And so I'd be happy to go into this in more detail, but essentially, as my mentor Douglas Massey has argued persuasively, the closing down of there used to be a lot of flows between Mexico and the United States, and that led to a lower overall supply of workers at low levels of at say low paying occupations. But when the country decided to close the border to Mexico, that made it impossible for people to move back. And the net result, ironically, was that there were a much higher percentage of the US population consisted of illegal immigrants who had very difficult time negotiating for fair wages. And that hurt not only their incomes, but the incomes of people that needed to compete with them. So the point is that markets can be distorted to the disadvantage of low-skilled workers and to the advantage of high-skilled workers. Now, as to the history of segregation in the United States, I just want to point out that during most of the 20th century, segregation was rising and peaked in 1970 using the most conventional measures of segregation. And so while we think of slavery as ending hundreds of years ago and in the Jim Crow system being completely behind us, it's important to point out that segregation peaked fairly recently in US history. And that's one of the reasons why we have yet to overcome many of the gaps in neighborhood quality that we see today and the consequences for quality and access to schooling. Now, what happens when you give people better access to schooling is you see strong results. And so in data on pre-K students around the country that was collected by a group of scholars, you see that changes in cognitive ability using either math or linguistic skills increased by somewhere between 0.2 and 0.37 standard deviations when Black students were assigned into high quality classrooms as opposed to low quality classrooms using a standardized rubric of classroom quality that was designed by the scholars. It's interesting that you didn't see the same changes among white students. And I think that speaks to the fact that schooling can provide a way to remediate some of the inequalities in family life and neighborhoods that have been generated by the legacy of our Jim Crow system. Now, I want to have a few replies to potential criticisms of this thesis that the unequal access to development of talent is an important consideration. One is that group differences in cognitive ability are dynamic throughout US history and have changed over many periods. So groups that score near the top of cognitive ability test scores today, several decades ago, scored near the bottom. And so there's nothing fixed about where groups fall on these measures. And within the United States and globally, we've seen an explosion of IQ scores. And this can only be attributed to environmental factors. I'm happy to discuss the evidence for that in much more detail. But the bottom line is that providing people access to high quality educational experiences has direct consequences for measured IQ, measured cognitive ability, and measured non-cognitive ability, all of which affect the income distribution. We also see that immigrant communities that move to rich countries from poor countries earlier in their life. So if you compare siblings, for example, and one sibling moves when he or she is 10 years old, and say his sister moves when she's 1, the sister's cognitive ability scores are going to be much higher as a result of access to that higher quality schooling. That's a pattern that jumps out of the data. And I'm running out of time, so I will wrap this up and look forward to continuing the conversation. But just want to point out that there's a lot of evidence in my book that goes into a lot of detail about how the unequal access to the realization of talent has worked in the United States, and how powerful interest groups have created special rules and privileges that have made it easier for their members to earn extraordinary incomes. And I hope we also get a chance to talk about what I think are some of the most important solutions, and I've already hinted at many of them. The bottom line is that in my way of thinking, a just society allows people to do the work they do best, the work they find engaging and purposeful, and results not in a completely egalitarian distribution of income, but a fairly healthy, robust distribution of income that you could say is fair and acceptable, in that it allows people who contribute more to earn more, but still compensates people at the bottom and gives them a fair chance to earn their income, the income that their skills and abilities would allow them to earn. And with that, I'll turn it over to our panel. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks. Thanks very much, Jonathan. Let's see, I'm going to stop the sharing here. It's not letting me do that. You got it? Okay. All right, so next we're going to have Jessica Trounstine do a commentary on Jonathan's research. Jessica Trounstine earned her PhD in political science from UC San Diego in 2004, and now serves as the Foundation Board of Trustees Presidential Chair of Political Science at UC Merced and Chair of the Political Science Department. Before joining UC Merced in 2009, Trounstine served as an assistant professor of politics and public policy at Princeton University. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Segregation by Design, Local Politics and Inequality in American Cities from Cambridge University Press, and Political Monopolies in American Cities, The Rise and Fall of Bosses and Reformers from University of Chicago Press, and of numerous articles and book chapters. Trounstine's work studies the process and quality of representation in American democracy. She focuses on the ways in which formal and informal local political institutions generate inequalities. Trounstine's scholarship is mixed method, reliant on historical analysis, case studies, experiments, and large and quantitative analyses. She has served as a consultant for the U.S. Department of Justice, city governments, and various community organizations, and serves on numerous editorial and foundation boards. Professor Trounstine.
Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to comment on Jonathan's book. I have to start off by saying that Jonathan was my student at Princeton, so I get to comment on his book. That's my right as his former faculty member, even though it was just on his way out. So. Dr. Rothwell has written a thought-provoking, as you can see, data-rich book that makes a compelling case for thinking about economic inequality as the natural outcome of extreme political inequality. I learned a great deal from the book. The connection between political inequality and economic inequality, Rothwell tells us, is the result of the purposeful foreclosing of opportunity, for those at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy by those at the top. And I know you just heard him present this, but I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you a summary of his argument so that we can walk through it together. So Rothwell makes this argument in several steps. First, he uses an extensive, amazing review of the literature, as well as his own original research, to offer evidence of what doesn't cause inequality. Those things are free trade and immigration. Then he lays out his conception of a just society, drawing on several theoretical tenets that were developed by famous philosopher John Rawls. As you heard, one crucial component of the just society, which Rothwell argues has been distorted in today's world, is that income should be the result of productivity or value, the value that is created by one's work. The problem in my mind with this assertion is twofold. First, it assumes that we could plausibly, accurately, and consistently measure value of work. I think this is a dubious assumption. Second, it assumes that everyone agrees on what is valuable. Again, I think this is a problematic assumption. Rothwell argues in the book forcefully that neither of these are problematic, but I'm not so sure. Let's think of a very basic example. Let's imagine a city, happens to be one where I live, that needs to hire some police officers. This is a city with a heavy Hmong and Latino presence and a severe pattern of local youth getting swept up into drug selling and not finishing high school. The city decides, in order to hire police officers, that they're going to have a civil service exam, and then they're going to pick the top scoring candidates and hire them as police officers. Okay, that seems okay. So they give the candidates this civil service exam, and they find that the top scoring people, prospective candidates on this exam, are all white and they all speak only English. Well, the city decides that this is a problem. They need Hmong and Latino police officers because the white police officers can't speak the language in the Hmong and Latino community. So they decide that they're going to put aside the results of the civil service exam, and they're going to hire at least one Hmong and one Latino police officer, even though they scored slightly lower on the civil service exam. Perhaps these police officers perform slightly less well than their white colleagues in terms of crime clearance and other police duties. And so they are paid less according to their merit or their value for productive police work. But what we don't see is that their simple presence in the community led 3 children to decide that they'd rather go into law enforcement instead of dropping out of school and engaging in the drug market. These police officers' value is much, much higher than their police record would suggest, but we'd have no way to include this in their pay. We'd have no way to measure it. Additionally, reasonable people might disagree about which outcome produced by the police officers was more meritorious. Which thing was more valuable? Was it more valuable that they inspired these young children, or was it more valuable that they failed to clear as many crimes in the police unit? This is all not even mentioning the fact that the civil service exam, which might have prohibited these police officers from getting hired in the first place, might itself be marked by racial bias and inequity. On the other side, and this is something that Rothwell discusses quite a lot throughout the book, is that merit pay cannot take into account the very bad luck that some people may experience over their life course, such as being born into a neighborhood where lots of peers don't graduate from high school and sell drugs instead, or being born in a nation that refuses to educate girls, thereby foreclosing the opportunity to immigrate to the United States under Rothwell's merit program. In the next section of the book, Rothwell lays out what he does say, what he says does cause inequality, namely unequal access to education, housing, and certain professional association markets. He presents a very convincing case for all of these different pieces. First, he tells us that inequality in income and health outcomes are not the result of innate intelligence or cognitive capacity, but rather the opportunity to attend high-quality schools and stable environments. Such opportunities, he says, are dictated by access to housing. Rothwell again gives us extremely compelling evidence that African Americans and the poor have been excluded from high opportunity neighborhoods by both restrictive covenants and zoning. Future work, maybe by Rothwell himself, I'm sure, will show a tighter coupling between the changes in these different markets and the inequality that he introduces at the beginning of the book. Let me just give you a small example of this. Segregation peaked in the United States. Neighborhood level segregation peaked in 1970. But inequality only began to ramp up in 1970. If segregation is the cause of this inequality, we need to better understand how we get from housing inequality to income inequality 30 years, 40 years later. The solutions to this opportunity hoarding, Rothwell asserts, is to open these markets, education markets, housing markets, and markets for careers. The trouble is that Dr. Rothwell does not seriously contend with the political requirements for doing so. If we believe his argument that political inequality has led to economic inequality, this is not hard to convince a political scientist of. This is bread and butter political science, right? This is what we think is wrong with the world, is that there's political inequality. So I believe it. Then it should be clear that the stakes in protecting these advantages are enormous. I do work on segregation. And one of the things that I always say to people who want to fix it, I talk to a lot of housing advocates, they want to fix segregation right now. The first thing that they have to do is realize in their heart of hearts, truly understand segregation is purposeful. It has been done on purpose. And those people who benefit from segregation will be the loudest and strongest opponents to undoing that situation. Fixing that is a political problem. It is not an economic problem. Undoing injustice means forcing those with privilege to give it up. This is no easy task. I'll end with one final completely disconnected thought, because I thought of it. Rothwell argues that the explanations of inequality need to contend with race. And I think that he could make this argument and point even more strongly. Early on in the book, Rothwell argues that inequality and slow economic growth led to a lack of confidence in government and the rise of candidates like Donald Trump. The problem is that Donald Trump did not win the support of most poor voters in America. He won the support of most poor Republicans, but most poor people in America are Democrats. Indeed, poor people have already sorted themselves into the parties, and the poor people who have sorted themselves into the Republican Party are almost exclusively white. What this tells us is that inequality and slow growth has produced a white racial backlash, not an uprising of the poor.
Thank you very much, Professor Trounstine. And finally, we have Christopher Fryman. Christopher Fryman is Associate Professor of Philosophy at William and Mary. He is the author of 2 books, with a third titled, Should We Have Open Borders? A Debate with Hrishikesh Joshi, under contract at Routledge Press. Chris has also published over 30 articles and chapters on topics including democratic theory, distributive justice, and immigration. His work has appeared in venues such as the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, Philosophical Studies, the Journal of Ethics, Utilitas, Ratio, the Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy, Politics, Philosophy and Economics, and the Oxford Handbook of Political Philosophy. His writing has been featured in a variety of popular outlets, including Reason Magazine, Eon, and Inside Higher Education. Chris's recognition at William and Mary includes an Alumni Fellowship Award for Excellence in Teaching and the Class of 1963 Term Distinguished Associate Professorship of Philosophy. Professor Fryman.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this book. I'm a philosopher, and so this gave me a good excuse to get caught up on some social science. I get most of it from Twitter these days, which is not a good idea. But I found the book convincing. I particularly found its nonpartisan approach very refreshing. But because I am a philosopher and not a social scientist, I have some, let's say, pedantic, theoretical, let's call them musings, really more than anything. So I have really sort of 3 main thoughts. So the first, I guess, question that I have is, what is the importance of equality as such? because we can draw a conceptual distinction between something like poverty and inequality. So there's a gap between millionaires and billionaires, but we might not care about that because there's no poverty. And so I'm curious to what extent we should be concerned about inequality as such, as opposed to poverty or say inequality as a symptom of some sort of underlying procedural injustice. So morally speaking, we might only care about economic inequality insofar as it affects people's absolute well-being. And this is plausible. I think that's a pretty good position to hold. So we'd say we're not really worried about the gap between the rich and the super rich because there's no poverty there. The gap doesn't matter. But of course, in other cases, economic inequality can have an effect on our absolute well-being. And one discussion of this in the book that I found really fascinating suggests that inequality might have an effect on confidence in institutions. So Jonathan has this really interesting discussion of high growth, high inequality economies versus high growth, low inequality economies. And when you get less inequality, you actually get higher confidence. And I'm just sort of curious to hear more about why that might be. So one explanation might be that people have a sense of their standing in the national income distribution. And so even if you have people with the same amount of material welfare in absolute terms, they see the big gap. And so this diminishes their confidence in our institutions. Although I'd be a little bit skeptical that people actually know what their standing is in the national income distribution, just for familiar sort of rational ignorance type consideration. So the idea here is that it takes time and effort to acquire information about something like the national income distribution. You can't really do anything useful with it. It's not really beneficial. And so it's rational to be ignorant about that. And so I might be a little bit skeptical about that mechanism. It could be the case that people resent the inequality because they recognize some sort of underlying procedural unfairness. And I think that fits very well with the story in the book. Here again, people might be rationally ignorant of that too. They probably don't know a lot about housing regulation or occupational licensing. And one other thing too, maybe a reason to be skeptical about people's knowledge of, or let's say concern for national income distributions, is it seems at least intuitively that what we might care most about are gaps within our local reference network. So I don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about Bill Gates, even though he makes a lot more money than I do. Or to take an even more personal example, one of my roommates in college, he's now like a partner at like a fancy law firm in a big city. He makes so much more money than me. It's unbelievable, but I don't care. But what I care about is if like another professor down the hall gets a raise that's like $10 more than I do. That's the thing that I really care about. Maybe that's just me. Maybe that's a moral failing. And so I think the idea might be that inequality is really a symptom of the issue. The real issue is the underlying procedural unfairness. But that was something I was curious about. A second thought is the relationship between merits and inequality. So both in the talk and in the book, there's this really nice critical discussion of equality and cognitive ability, that the inequalities that we see today can't be plausibly attributed to differences in cognitive ability. But I take it that's mostly a critical story, sort of dispelling the myth that this is the explanation for why we have inequality. But I'd like to hear more about the positive story about what would justify an inequality. And so you talk about value to society. So I think maybe you have something like marginal productivity in mind. I like that view. But we might not want to identify this with merit, just because marginal productivity, even if we had truly open markets in the right sort of way, marginal productivity can vary for all sorts of reasons. So one example that comes to mind is this product called the Snuggie, which is like a blanket with like sleeves in it, which is, no, I looked this up. The guy made like $400 million from this invent. His name's Scott Boylan. I looked it up. And now, did he merit the money? I think in a sense, yes, because he found millions and millions of people willing to pay for the Snuggie. But it's not obvious to me that he would have like a higher IQ than a math professor, for example. Or suppose like the idea like for the Snuggie came to him in like a dream or something like that. Like he's like, oh, it's a great idea. That's like pure luck that enabled him to contribute this allegedly significant value to society. So we might not want to say like he's meritorious exactly. even though we might say for sort of efficiency reasons, like we want a system that rewards people who come up with these ideas that people like. Another example might be less fanciful. This is sort of just a mind-blowing statistic. 17% of Americans who are over 7 feet taller in the NBA, which that like blows my mind. And so you say, like, that's luck. If you're 17 feet tall, that would be a lot of luck. If you're 7 feet tall, that's a lot of luck and enables you to earn millions of dollars in the NBA. But we might think that inequality is morally problematic for a similar sort of reason that, you know, being born into a certain neighborhood and having that really affect your life prospects is problematic because it's all a matter of luck. So maybe it's just kind of luck all the way down. And it's not about merit at all. Maybe we just want to talk about efficiency. You know, I think there's some plausibility there. And then last but not least, I love your ideas for reform, but I always worry there's kind of a chicken and the egg problem, which is we say, okay, a lot of the reason why we have powerful special interests capturing industries. So you talk about Mansur Olson, you say there are these concentrated benefits. Suppose you're a dentist. It's really in your interest to know about licensing for dentists and to push really hard to make sure that like dental hygienists can't set up a competing practice. Like this is very beneficial for you. But for everybody in this room, because of the rational ignorance problem, it's not worth your time to do the research because all you could do is maybe cast a more informed vote. But of course, that's not going to change anything. And so the idea is that the people who have the strongest interests in perpetuating this regulation are the ones who are invariably going to win out. And so we could propose something like deregulation as a solution, but the worry is that the solution is always going to be undermined by the very problem it's intended to solve. So we could have we could have an informed electorate push through this reform, but if we had a rational electorate, then we wouldn't have the issue in the first place. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Fryman. And I think what we'd like to do now is go first for Q&A to our in-person audience. And then we can also take questions from our Zoom audience, and our program coordinator, Hannah Beaudry, will come up and give us those questions. So questions from the audience. I'm going to give you this mic here so that at least everyone in the room can hear.
Okay, so it seems like a lot of these problems are quite intractable. And so for just this one moment, I would like to give each of you like one magic wish come true about some change that feels like it can't move. And what, if you could only have this one thing that you got to actually manifest in our world, what would that one shift change be?
All right, and repeating the question for our Zoom audience, the question is, what is the one magic change? If you could make one magic change in the world to address this problem, what would it be? You'll have to come to the mic.
Yeah, it's a tough question, but I'd have to go with eliminating regulations on housing density. And the reason is that I think that plays a really big role in perpetuating, first of all, in helping to create the very high levels of segregation that we have in the United States today, and then in perpetuating it. Essentially, communities are allowed to discriminate based on income. And so there are many affluent communities around the world or around the country, particularly in the United States as it happens, because these kind of regulations are much less common outside the United States, where it's impossible, it's illegal to build apartment complexes. It's illegal to build even single family attached housing. And so the schools are only available to the richest members of society, and the market itself is essentially closed to lower income people. And so that would be, if I could change only one thing, that would be probably it.
Could you just come up and just reaffirm that?
Yeah, I completely agree with Jonathan that eliminating density regulations, and actually I might take it more, I might be more forceful and say forcing density in our most exclusive neighborhoods would be something that I would magically have happen.
So I would say if we're talking domestically, I agree. But I think if we're talking all things considered internationally as well, I would say liberalizing immigration, making it easier to immigrate. I think there are rights-based reasons for this, that people have the right to move and work as they please. But I think there are consequentialist reasons for this. It would just have very good consequences. It would make the world a lot richer.
All right, and we will go next to a Zoom question, but first, Jonathan has asked for a couple moments to respond to his critics. So I'm gonna hand it over to you to do so.
Thank you, Jason. And I want to thank Jessica and Chris for really thoughtful comments. So I want to address each of them. I'll try to quickly. First of all, Jessica brought a really great point. It's very hard to recognize value and productivity. And I don't think I'm very clear in the book about to what extent I think that pay should be based on merit in practical ways. I think, if you think of a perspective of you're a company or you're a manager at a big company, you want to try to reward your employees to some extent based on merit. And it's not like it's the only thing that matters. There's going to be some baseline pay that everybody who works for your company gets. But then the people who put in extraordinary effort or go above and beyond in performance, to me, it doesn't matter whether it's luck, and in many cases it probably would be luck, and it doesn't matter to me whether it's luck based on how you think about their genetic endowment or how tall they are, or whether it's luck based on they randomly bumped into somebody who ended up being a client who gave them a huge contract. That should be rewarded in some way. I think that's just sort of management 101. You should pay people to some extent based on performance. Now, the to some extent part is, I think, where it gets really tricky. And you brought up a really compelling example of like, well, there are all these unmeasurable aspects of somebody's value to society, or even value to community, or value to their organizations if they're a police department, that would be impractical, if not impossible, to measure. And so I think there's just got to be humility in terms of people who are responsible for setting pay and income, and recognizing that, and in the cases where it is obvious that somebody has gone above and beyond, you maybe give them some sort of extra compensation, especially if it's regular repetitive behavior, but that there's still some sort of baseline recognition. It's a good point about timing. The second point you brought up, Jessica, about thinking about how these big changes in society that I think are responsible for distinguishing the United States, how the timing of it is played out. So for the segregation, I do think it's plausible to think of it as having long-term consequences. And I think you weren't ruling this out, but the fact that segregation peaked in 1970, I think would have the biggest impact on children who were born around 1970. And then there's also the fact that racial segregation has been declining since, but economic segregation has been increasing. So the net result is complicated. I think it does warrant a lot more additional research. As to the third point you brought up about the relationship between slow economic growth and a white racial backlash, I think that's fair enough. I would say, though, that there's also been a backlash on the left. And so I see populism in the form of the support for Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's presidency, as well as the support for Donald Trump's version of conservatism, had some things in common that you could describe as populism. Both of them both wings were anti-trade and anti-immigration in some important respects. Now, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren had a much more arguably humane approach to how they would deal with immigration from my perspective. But in the end, a lot of skepticism from Bernie Sanders in particular, and about the benefits of immigration and certainly trade. So there's and both Trump, ironically, and the sort of populist left were very anti-corporate America. And the most obvious recent example of that is just before Trump left office, he tried to pass legislation that would have proposed pretty dramatic regulations on the tech sector. And he was no fan of Facebook and Twitter, and in part because they banned him. But he was very much along the line. He's speaking some of the same rhetoric as those on the far left in terms of his hostility to corporations. So I think that's part of the slow growth And that actually leads me to one of Chris's points about declining confidence in institutions. And I do think that you sort of hinted at that this was there in my book, maybe kind of buried in there, but I think the point about the procedural, the kind of recognition that if there's high inequality, as that global survey we did after I published the book found, most people around the world think inequality in their country is unfair, but 69% globally. And so I think what's going on is people are saying, if there's such extreme gaps between the rich and poor, there's got to be something fishy going on. That something's being rigged. And usually in developing countries, something is very clearly being rigged because you can see that cronies of the party that's in power get all these special privileges, and then they're the ones who get their contracts approved and so on. So it could be obvious in those respects. I mean, although harder for maybe the poorest people to know that that's going on, especially if it's not covered in the national press, if the media is restricted. In the United States, I think this has come up a bit in the backlash, which you see on the right and left to the high cost of higher education. Excuse me for saying that here, but it's a fact that everybody's frustrated with, right? The extraordinary cost of housing is something that unifies people on the right and left, and the fact that we're being raked over the coals on healthcare. I mean, nobody likes these hospital bills where you pay $1,000 for an aspirin and you're just at the whims of negotiating these crazy prices. So I think that's where people might not recognize the extent to which those things are feeding into this overall sense of inequality. But I think people overall in the United States don't resent the Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. And I certainly don't. I'm happy to see people become rich when they make something, even if it's a Snuggie, that doesn't necessarily enhance the livelihoods of, at least as I see it. But there are people out there who love their Snuggies. So that if they're willing to pay, $20 for a Snuggie, then I'm all right with that, with the owner becoming a millionaire. It doesn't bother me. And that speaks to your point about merit. And then, the final point about reform, I just want to say these powerful interest groups have incentives to arrange things to their benefit, and it's very hard for ordinary people to care about and to know about it, to care about it and combat it. So I do think we need institutions that are along the lines of the Federal Trade Commission, but operate at the state level, maybe the local level, that are monitoring industry associations and professional associations and saying, well, it's fine to have your bar exam and have certain regulations that improve the quality of the services, but you can't go too far, and you can't say that nurse practitioners and dental hygienists can't provide services unless they compensate the more highly regulated professions. And so we need some institutions to do that work for us.
Another question from the audience.
Thank you. Very interesting work you guys are doing. Dr. Thomas Sowell, in his recent book, Discrimination and Disparities, points out that the biggest problem we have in terms of the lower end of the income cycle there is more disparity than discrimination. Now, here's a fellow who grew up with Jim Crow, lived in Harlem, so on and so forth, and bringing it here home to New Hampshire, hopefully 2022 will be a better number, but across the state, our proficiency in reading, math, and science in the high school level is less than 50%. We have another program in the state called VALIX. It's free, it's open to anyone. You can do anything from learning how to turn a wrench to programming. That is all available, not depending on who you are or where you live. So my question is, based upon that information, what power does merit and the system of a work ethic have in moving aside the potential of a racial disparity in our society?
Any one of you can tackle that question if you like. But would you restate it briefly for the audience?
Yes. So Yeah, to restate the end of that question, what role does merit play, but also you could say test scores and cognitive ability, learning, literacy, numeracy, but also what social scientists call non-cognitive skills like determination, work ethic, and so on. What role do those factors play in reducing racial disparities in, say, income in adulthood? So that's a great question, and I try to take that on as directly as possible in the book. And so some of the things I emphasize that I want to restate here is that formal institutions, like the quality of pre-K through high school education, can play an important role in eliminating some of those gaps. And there's some very compelling quasi-experimental and experimental evidence looking at what happens when, say, for example, kids who are trying to go to a charter school that's oversubscribed enter a lottery, and then some go to a good charter school and some go to a bad charter school. And what happens immediately, and then what happens a few years down the road, maybe even 10 years down the road, in terms of the outcomes of those kids. And there are some meaningful differences in those outcomes. And likewise, some very careful studies have shown that early childhood educational experiences that are higher quality can have long-lasting benefits. Now, I don't think anyone who's following that literature closely thinks that that's the only thing that needs to happen. If we just improve school quality for kids in the worst off circumstances, that's going to completely do it. There's also evidence from looking at what happens at the household level and the family level that is very important to consider. And so I spent some time in the book discussing some of the habits of parents in highly successful, often immigrant families in England and in the United States. And what they seem to have in common is this belief that their children can learn and develop and advance. And if they pour in a lot of effort and resources into teaching them, there's going to be results in the other end. And they have resources themselves to read about the best practices in child development, and are reading to their children on a regular basis, every night if they're young kids, and doing those kinds of practices that result in learning performance. So when you look at the behavior of children in those kind of upwardly mobile households, they're spending more time studying than they are watching TV, whereas it's flipped in the other direction for the other kids. So the question is, can there be anything done about that? And I think the answer is yes. And there's some compelling studies that look at programs as simple as sending text messages to parents to remind them to read to their kids. And especially if they're coming from a low literacy family themselves, when their parents didn't read to them, they're not just going to naturally come to the idea that this is what parenting involves, reading to their kids every night. And so, but if somebody at their school and somebody they trust in their community tells them that this is a great idea and it's going to improve their kids' lives over the long run, and they send them things like text reminders, or they send them books, as this Dolly Parton sponsored program does, send books to my kids, for example, live in DC, and every kid born in DC gets a book from Dolly Parton's foundation for the first few years of their life. And there's been some careful studies that have shown that this has long measurable consequences on literacy and so on. So these are, you could call these cultural practices, but they're not cultural practices in the sense that they're passed down through ancient traditions. In fact, most humans on planet Earth didn't know how to read until quite recently. So there's nothing that's kind of deeply human about this. We have to, but we're flexible, and we can learn from each other, and we can learn from people in our community. So I think that's also one of the reasons I'm so concerned about segregation, economic and racial, is because when you isolate people who don't have those kinds of practices, they don't have a chance to talk to people they trust and who care about them, that can give them other alternative ideas.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're going to take one question from online first, and then back to the audience, and then we'll wrap it up. So Hannah's going to read us a question from an audience member online.
Okay, this question is for Jonathan. Deborah is asking you to clarify the tool being used to measure cognitive ability.
So in the work that I presented here, most of it was based on what is called the PIAC exam, which is administered by the OECD. It stands for the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. And people can go on and kind of take the exam if they want it. The data that it's based on comes through a very rigorous process where they developed an assessment of 3 components of what you could call competency. So one is literacy, and you can imagine what a literacy exam looks like, where you read paragraphs and you have to answer multiple choice questions that show you understand the content and so on. And then there's numeracy, where you're performing, various mathematical calculations, so the varying complexity. And then there's a technology section that basically tests whether, to what extent you're familiar with technology, how you can navigate and use it. And all 3 of those things, if you measure them individually, are predictive of income around the world. I rolled them together into one measure, and I'm calling that kind of general cognitive ability, because the way that from the psychological literature, basically the interpretation is that your performance on any kind of test of cognitive ability is going to be correlated with your performance on another test. And you get a better, more accurate measure when you roll them all together. So that's how that's one of the main data sources used in the book for looking at that. But there are many other, and I also talk about kind of the history of IQ testing in the United States and why I think it shouldn't be interpreted as any kind of measure of genetic capacity or ability. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, one more question from an audience member, Elsa.
Well, I read the new Jim Crow, I've forgotten, by Michelle something. Alexander, right. And the most striking fact out of that was that when Ronald Reagan was president, he declared war on drugs before it was really a problem. At the same time, he instructed the CIA to let all the cocaine in from South America to create the drug problem. And we decimated the Black people's families by putting the men in prison, and even more recently, women in prison, taking away their children. We did that after we decimated the indigenous population in this country, and I'm surprised nobody cares about giving reparations to try and help these people come up from the bad situations they live in today. And they don't even, felons in many states can't ever vote again. And then Trump created a law that said if you came into this country illegally, they'd send you back. If you did it again, you were going into prison because of the prisons in this country that are owned by capitalists.
So Elsa, could you clarify your question for the sake of Jonathan? Just
why wouldn't any of you even consider reparations to people that should get it?
okay, so Elsa's question is about reparations to those who have suffered inequalities in our past. Anybody want to tackle that one? Okay, you have to come to the microphone. Okay. Okay. Jessica is going to brave this.
So we were only allowed one solution by the prior questioner. I'm a big supporter of reparations, but if I had to pick one, I could imagine a more immediate, a more politically plausible, and a more long-lasting solution by densifying our privileged neighborhoods. But that's not to say that that's the only solution, and reparations should certainly be considered a part of any policy solution. But it's a good question for Jonathan because he doesn't talk about reparations in the book, and so maybe I'll.
Chris wants to speak to this.
Well, so this is actually self-promotion. I actually wrote a co-authored a paper called Drug War Reparations. And you can read it, it's free online if you want to read it. And I argue that, yeah, the state should in fact pay reparations for the drug war, not just the drug war, but it was a state enforced injustice. And I think state enforced reparation is the appropriate response to that. So.
Yeah, thank you, Chris and Jonathan.
So I'm very sympathetic to Michelle Alexander's argument and the new Jim Crow, and spend a little bit of time in the book talking about some of those themes, and completely agree. It sounds like with Chris too, that the drug war has been a catastrophic mistake and really an unfair and abusive use of power, and one that has dramatically disproportionately hurt African Americans. And I use the enforcement of drugs as an example of political inequality. I think it's very clear when you look at the data, which actually show that drug sales and drug use are no higher in African American populations than they are in white populations, and yet the risk of being arrested is dramatically higher if you're African American than if you're white. So that's just manifestly unfair, obviously unfair, and I want to read Chris's paper now because I'd probably agree that that would be a very appropriate avenue for reparations. As to general, I mean, my only problem with the discourse on reparations is that it can be very general, very broad, and I think it's a lot more useful to think about actual cases like reparations for drug war, reparations for something else, and then I'd be very happy to consider what that would look like. But I like the idea very much that when the state or when formal institutions are responsible for a harm, then they should compensate.
Great, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Elsa, for your question. So that concludes our program for today. We went on a bit longer than we expected, but I think that's a sign of how interesting, lively, and insightful some of these remarks were. I want to thank Jonathan especially for his insightful remarks that I think give us a lot to think about, and also Jessica and Chris for your really stimulating responses to that, and also all of you in the audience here and online for attending and for your wonderful questions. And I thank you again for your support of the center. Please keep an eye on upcoming programs at our website, www.anselm.edu/ethics. And thank you again. Have a good evening.